I want to thank INSA and, of course, Mantech and our other sponsors today. I'm very honored to moderate such a distinguished panel consisting of the first three DNIs who, in addition to their service as head of the intelligence community, contributed decades of service across the federal government in the national security area for their country. And so I just want to recognize that up front and how fortunate we are to have all of you today. These men actually need no introduction. I think what we'll do is we'll go immediately into a brief opening statement from each of you. We'll start with Ambassador Negroponte as the first to hold the DNI job. Then we'll go to Admiral McConnell and then Admiral Blair. And then I'll jump in with questions. And then towards the end, we'll take a few questions from the audience. Ambassador Negroponte.
Thank you, Michael. Good morning, everybody. Also, good morning to my fellow panelists who also had the privilege of serving as Director of National Intelligence. As was mentioned, I was the first. And a number of you have heard this story before, but I was sitting in my office in Baghdad, Iraq, where I was ambassador to that country when I got a call from the Chief of Staff of President Bush asking me if I'd like to be the first Director of National Intelligence. And I reflected upon it, consulted with my wife, who actually was very eager for me to come back home. She said, take it, take it. That was sort of how it happened. It was a startup, as was mentioned. We started with a handful of people in the old executive office building and then built it up to something approximating what it is today. I was a little bit agnostic on the law itself because I'd not been back home for that debate. My last connection with that part of the intelligence debate had been when I sat behind Colin Powell. You remember the famous photo of Powell presenting to the UN Security Council the vial of supposed poisonous substance of some kind or another as he was making the case that there were WMD in Iraq to the UN Security Council, and that turned out to be incorrect. He had two Greek Americans behind him, John Negroponte and George Tenet. That was the part that was noted in all the Greek newspapers. But it was an occurrence, I think, that has sort of left a scar, if you will, on Colin Powell ever since. And I think his confidence in the intelligence community plummeted to zero. So I think with the revelation, with that, and then the curveball incident where we'd relied on some very weak information, I think reform was inevitable. We did the best we could to set it up. We helped create the institutions to which Senator Collins referred, and I think she gave a very good summary of that reform effort. And I left the job almost 2 years later to move to another position in the government, but I think satisfied that we'd given it our best shot. I guess my bottom line would be that the institution and the organization can always be perfected. I'm delighted to see that the senator is on the Senate Intelligence Committee, because if there's a place from which one can advocate perfecting amendments, something with Vice President Cheney always mentioned. He always said, there may be a point at which time you may want to suggest some perfecting amendments. I think she's in a good position to do that. But I'd say that as the first cut at this, I think it was a good job, given all the compromises that had to be made. I think the intelligence community needs a manager. I guess I would use that word. Somebody to carry out what was defined in the old DCI responsibilities as community management. That was the function, and that was the function that was lopped off the CIA and the DCI and shifted over basically to the ODNI. It was in fact almost as simple as that. It was the old CMS community management function combined with a few of these other centers, some of which took on a fairly high priority. So I think we just need to steady as we go, look for opportunities to improve, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Ambassador. Admiral McConnell?
I think the bill, as captured by your book, which I thought was exceptional, achieved all it could achieve, given the personalities and the time and so on, the pressure of the 9/11 report, and then the pushback from the vested interest in the Congress to maintain their position, their power. I grew up as a military intelligence officer, and I disagreed with Duncan Hunter and Secretary Rumsfeld about harming military intelligence. I know how to do that. I just disagreed with that position. When I was contacted about coming in as the second DNI, because Secretary Rice was pushing the president very hard to get John over to state to continue his diplomatic duties, I was not certain. As a matter of fact, I said no. And one of the reasons I said no was because Secretary Bob Gates had said no, and he was very public about it, and he defined it. Now here's a frame of reference from this observer. We're a nation of laws. The Congress appropriates money and then authorizes you to spend that money, and they provide an oversight function. We execute through departments. Department heads are all powerful, and I went through the observing the Secretary of Defense become more powerful with the Goldwater-Nichols Act of, I think it was 1986. And so the way I saw the position, you're not a department head. You have very few resources, so you were going to be a coordinator. So when I was asked to come in to be nominated to relieve Ambassador Negroponte, I said, well, can I take a few days? And the phone call I wanted to make was to Bob Gates. And the reason for that was it's an impossible job unless the Secretary of Defense and the DNI and others, but principally those two, can have a common vision and agree to share and participate and so on. And so he said he was supportive of the nomination, and sure he'd be happy to help me. What I wanted to do was take that little clause of the DNI cannot subjugate the chain of command of a department head, that little phrase, I think you captured in your book, and it was...
Shall not abrogate the chain of
shall
command.
not abrogate. What I tried to do was to change that when we redid Executive Order 12333. 12333 had been signed by President Reagan, hadn't been updated. I wanted to do it. Everybody was against doing it because they were afraid they would lose a position of power. And I just kept pushing, and I got the PIFIAB, now PIAB, to support me with the president. So we did that. And so David Shedd was clever enough to capture that language so we could reverse it. Rather than me having to prove I wasn't subjugating the authority of a Secretary of X, they had to prove that I was subjugating, so it turned it around a bit. Still didn't achieve what I hoped it would achieve. So I would say the DNI is a coordinator, not a director. I think it's better than it was. I think it could be better. So it's a work in progress, and that's how our system works. We'll wait to the next issue, and then we'll deal with it at another level.
Yes, sir. Admiral Blair?
I was DNI when we had the 5th anniversary of the IRTPA, and I was fired 2 weeks later, in part for trying to integrate the intelligence community more vigorously than the administration wanted it to be integrated. But I feel to this day that the intelligence community needs a leader, not a manager or a coordinator, if it is to fulfill its potential. Let me say that as far as the counterterrorism mission goes, we didn't need an IRTPA. The image of what happened on 9/11 is so seared in the consciousness of every American and certainly every intelligence officer that we were not going to allow personal prejudices or institutional prerogatives to get in the way of going against the nation's enemies, which had killed 3,000 of our countrymen. And if you looked at the Abdul Muttalib incident, which is the worst thing that happened on my watch, our problem, if anything, was oversharing of intelligence with under ability to pick out the important from the unimportant. So if all you wanted to do was improve our capability against terrorists, then you didn't need an IRTPA. What you do need, intelligence reform, is to put that same intensity and that same combined integrated structure against the other tough problems that we face. What are the North Koreans up to? How about Iran, Russia, China? Those tough problems which cannot be done by any by any organization, but need to be by dedicated teams who are passing information back and forth all the time, working continually, have the resources, have the obstacles to success knocked out by some higher authority rather than succumbing to institutional prerogatives or priorities. And that's what the promise of intelligence integration and a leader for the intelligence community should be. And I don't think we've made that much progress in the 5 years since I left in moving that direction, and I think we should. The specific things I think need to be done fall into several categories. On the financial side, the DNI has the capability to put together the budget for the intelligence community as it's submitted to Congress, and that's a very powerful tool. And I think that the community management staff, supplemented now by the SRA, the Strategy and Resources Center that was established when I was there, is doing a good job of allocating initial resources. But the ODNI does not have the budget flexibility in the year of execution that, for example, the Secretary of Defense has, and which I think is needed in order to make those adjustments, especially when budgets are coming down as they are now. On personnel, I believe that the Director of National Intelligence should actually have the ability to appoint all of the other leaders in the intelligence community, and I think it ought to go down a couple of levels, not just the directors of the agencies, but also the deputies and the third level in each one. You know who are the people in the intelligence community, the leaders who really are joint, who really think in the community teams, and those are the ones that we ought to move into those positions of leadership, not others. On the organizational front, I believe that we should, I think it's a complete anomaly that we put our Human Intelligence Gathering Center together with our All-Source Analysis Center in the CIA. No other country does it that way. It makes no sense in this era in which an increasingly large amount of our intelligence is coming from signals intelligence, especially over the internet. That's the sort, we count it, that's the source of 75% plus of all intelligence reporting. And yet somehow we have this human intelligence service that is paired with and sometimes dominates the all-source analytical sense in the CIA. I'd break those both up, have them report directly to the ODNI. I would give the Director of National Intelligence strong authority over covert operations rather than having a straight shot from the CIA to staffers in the White House, which has gotten us in trouble many, many times in the past. I'd have the more seasoned oversight of a DNI. And I would make the DNI the only political appointee within the intelligence community, and I would have the directors of these two branches of what used to be the CIA, the All-Source Analytical Agency, and the clandestine service be full-time career employees who have grown up in the system and know how to do it, and yet do not have the idea that they somehow have a political role, which I think should be reserved to the top job. So aside from that, I think we're in pretty good shape in the in our intelligence community reorganization, but there are a few pieces, I think, of unfinished business which we could attend to after we finish passing Senator Collins' cybersecurity, which I think doesn't go far enough, but we can talk about that. So is that enough red meat on the table, Michael?
That was great. I think we're ready to conclude now. Admiral Blair, I wonder if I could just go ahead and follow up with you a little bit. I mean, you cited some of the obstacles to your integration agenda. So much of the legislative history of the Intelligence Reform Act was about, well, DOD is going to resist what we're trying to do. Would your organizational remedies include assertion of authority, direction, and control over NSA, NRO, and NGA to the DNI? Would you tear those out of the formal chain in the Department of Defense?
You know, it was funny. I read about the Titanic battles that the Senator talked about and that Ambassador Negroponte experienced. When I arrived, those were not important, and I tried to figure out why that was. And I think the reason is that the big intelligence defense agencies had become joint agencies, and they knew they had to supply intelligence to many different customers, whether they were the services who had to build equipment, or whether they were troops in the field who needed to know where the next bomb was being planted. The military leaders in the intelligence community had grown up learning how to turn the amazing collection and distribution skills of their agencies to serve many customers. And I found that they had no trouble also turning those same tools to serve policymakers in the White House, in the NSC, in the State Department. So I didn't find that problem, and I think it was because of the nature of the development of the leadership and of the demands on those organizations. So that, I think,
what were
turned
the
out not
obstacles?
to be a problem.
Were they statutory? Was it the National Security Council? Was it other bureaucratic resistance?
Well, I think the other thing was that reality intruded in that this age-old distinction between national problems on the one hand and military problems on the other hand had sort of disappeared. When you were talking about Iraq, policymakers needed to know not only what the political situation was in Iraq and the neighboring countries, but so too did the military leaders who were out there running the troops. The military leaders needed to know where the IED would be located, but they also needed to know who was the power in the village, what were the tribal characteristics. So I saw what had traditionally been national and military intelligence fusing. Leaders, whether they were in the White House or or out in the field, needed to know basically the same information, and therefore there was not this civil-military split, which had been true in the past.
I see. Admiral McConnell, you, at the same conference that Admiral Blair mentioned, endorsed actually creating a Secretary of Intelligence. You referenced your own testimony at the Senate Intelligence Committee a few years prior to that you didn't want to be considered a director of national intelligence. You were more of a coordinator of national intelligence. To me, this sort of hits up an issue that we experienced through the rush to legislate, that there wasn't really a meeting of the minds of what the DNI is. I compiled a list. Some people thought it was a chairman of the board, others a CEO. Some people thought it was the manager of a baseball team. Others, of course, called it a quarterback, and people said, well, no, it can't be a quarterback because a quarterback is operational. It better be a coach. And then, of course, Secretary Gates called it the chairman of an unwieldy congressional committee. Help us, and I think this is important, help us try and conceptualize what the DNI's role is in the intelligence community so that we might be able to continue to go forward and discern lanes in the road.
Well, let me start by commenting on what Admiral Blair mentioned about this issue of direction, control, authority, and why it worked. And I think it worked largely on Ambassador Negroponte's watch, certainly worked on my watch, and it worked on his watch. And it was mostly a function of the people. Those of us who had come up through the system had focused on support military operations. We understood the national set of problems. And I would remind everyone that Bob Gates was the Secretary of Defense. And remember, he'd come up in the DI and CIA, had been on the National Security Staff, served as a Deputy National Security Advisor, and had been the Director of CIA. So he understood the community. So I think a lot of the issues of direction, control, and authority, when there's disagreement, didn't surface. But we're a nation of laws. We go by what's captured in the documentation. And when the special interest of the group, whether you're a committee in Congress or you're the Army or the Navy or the CIA or the whoever. When that interest is threatened, we're going to be governed by the documentation. So that was what the case I was attempting to make. If we want to have this community integrated and function with somebody at the head of it in a political position to be the intelligence advisor of the president, largely as outlined by Admiral Blair, then the law has to change. So I had a president who wanted intel first thing every morning for an hour, 6 days a week and often 7 days a week. I had a national security advisor that understood this community like the back of his hand. Gates was the Secretary of Defense. It worked for us not because the law said it had to work, it worked because of the people in the position. What I worry about is what happens when there's disagreement among those players or a different point of view. So when I made the case, not so much forcefully, we need a Secretary of Intelligence. We need to have that debate and go down that path to examine all the issues. I had the good fortune or misfortune, depending on your point of view, of shepherding the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act through the Congress for the Bush administration. Both houses in the opposition party, strong disagreement with the president's policy, and we had to update the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And I learned firsthand how difficult it is to make a law in this country. It is almost impossible to get agreement. I agree with Senator Collins' point of view. We've got to have a bill that changes the legislative landscape to address cybersecurity. We have to do that. And we've been dancing around that issue now for 5 or 6 years. In 2012, when she and Senator Lieberman put their bill on the table, that year we had 14 bills or amendments. They all failed. And we're still just admiring the problem. So we need to have that debate, a vigorous debate about integration of this community and how it's going to be managed. I would remind everyone that there's 17 segments to the U.S. intelligence community. It's the DNI and a staff, the CIA, and then everybody else works for a cabinet officer who has statutory authority to control those assets. And there will be disagreements in the future. I guess if I could prescribe a model that would work, it'd be the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. When Goldwater Nichols was passed, it took the chairman out of any responsibility to be operational. The chain of command is the President, Secretary of Defense, the area commander, the Joint Task Force commander. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs is the advisor. Now, neither the Secretary of Defense nor the President are going to do many military things without his advice, but that system works. So maybe we need to examine it along those lines.
Ambassador Negroponte, you're of course one of the nation's distinguished diplomats, but you also had the opportunity to see the intelligence community from the perspective of the head of the intelligence community. You cited an instance where we found the intelligence wanting, especially in the Iraq episode. I wonder if you might comment with both hats on. As a policymaker, what was the view or the typical view of the policymaker of the intelligence community? Was it integrated? Were you getting the information you needed, or were you able to understand, because you had also been DNI, the limitations of intelligence for policy?
I'll get to that in one sec, but if I could just go back to one thing that Admiral Blair said. I didn't have a Titanic battle in the civil-military area. In fact, I found I think I met every month with Secretary Rumsfeld, and I think things always went very smoothly. So at that time, we didn't have any big issues. I think it was the preamble. It was in the formation of the legislation, and Duncan Hunter was extremely proactive in all of that. I think as far as the quality of the intelligence during this entire period, I grew up working with intelligence all the time, right? I joined the Foreign Service when I was 21 years old, and I spent my life working in embassies around the world, and we always had a very close, almost symbiotic, in certain aspects, literally symbiotic relationship with the intelligence community. So I think early on, I gained an appreciation of what was and what was not possible. I think there's sometimes, particularly people who don't know anything about intelligence, think that there's some magic bullet out there, that if only you knew that secret that that other person knows, everything would be clear. Sometimes you meet foreigners who look at you as if there must be some place in the United States where it tells you everything that's going to happen for the next 6 months. I mean, there are people who have this kind of distorted view of what intelligence can do for you. But if you take it in perspective and see it as an element that you take into account, that the decision maker takes into account as they bring to bear many other factors, right? Their life experience, their judgment, their area knowledge, and so forth, their sense of the political feasibility of whatever action it is that they propose to take, then I think it is a very, very useful tool. And that would bring me to the issue of whether intelligence function, whether the function should be a cabinet level function, and I think I would disagree with that. I think intelligence is a support function. No, I mean, you can argue about how it's organized, but I certainly wouldn't promote it and elevate it up to being a cabinet level office in its own right. Just a couple other things, if I could, Michael, on budget. I remember vividly when President Bush walked me out in front of the White House press corps and said, you know, he's going to name me DNI and this and that, and John will be in charge of the budget. Well, you know, that's the last time I heard that. So I won't say anything further on that. And then as far as the utility of the function, it does vary from president to president. Let's not forget our basic civics here. The president is the man under Article 2 of the Constitution, responsible for our national security and our diplomacy. And he can pretty much, and if you look at history, he has pretty much organized his office any way he darn well chooses. And the models are extremely variable, from Woodrow Wilson to Franklin Roosevelt to Abraham Lincoln. Every one of them had kind of a slightly different approach. And even though we're in a much more modern environment today, I think it's true of a president today. They can organize their national security setup pretty much the way they want to. But the key, I think the most important thing I found in my experience was that the president, the national security advisor, the secretary of defense, and the secretary of state get along. I've lived through periods where sometimes those cabinet officials weren't on speaking terms. Like George Shultz and Caspar Weinberger, even though they'd worked for Bechtel before, by the end of the Reagan administration, they weren't on speaking terms. Well, what a way to run a railroad. So, personalities do matter, and particularly the effectiveness of that grouping on top. And if they are working in pretty good harmony, I think, as Admiral McConnell has suggested, then it's a little bit easier to be their senior intelligence advisor.
But Ambassador Negroponte, so many people have faulted the system for being personality dependent, and they say we need to build a system where the DNI has either got authorities or a relationship with the president, irrespective of person. Is that impossible?
And Admiral McConnell was making that point just now, and I think it's not impossible, but it's only possible up to a certain point. Personalities do matter. Why do we spend so much time studying them? Why do we spend so much time reading biographies of these different individuals, trying to understand what went right and what went wrong? And very often it comes down to some personality issue that actually derailed us or deflected us from maybe doing something better or doing the right thing instead of the wrong thing.
So it's always baked into
I
the
think
system.
there's always a personality element in this, especially since we've got a lot of authority concentrated in these individuals, and the president has an enormous amount of authority concentrated in his hands in foreign policy and national security.
Yeah. Admiral Blair, John Brennan testified at his confirmation hearing that he wanted to return the Central Intelligence Agency into a global espionage service. He didn't quite say that we had overinvested in counterterrorism, of course, appropriately so after 9/11, that became the nation's #1 priority. I wonder if you might comment, though, with the rise of ISIS and the other problems we're having in the Middle East, whether you still think it's whether you think it's necessary that we are able to tackle other problems around the globe, or are we just necessarily looking most intensely at the problems in the Middle East, given the rise of ISIS and our history with Al-Qaeda and the rest?
I think the emphasis that now, 14 years after 9/11, that we have on countering terrorism is bizarre and hurts the national security of this country. Between then and now, 17 Americans, as near as I can tell, have been killed by terrorists. 14 down in Fort Hood, and 3 at the Boston Marathon. And yet it's been the primary focus, certainly of the intelligence world during that time. The idea that we can, through intelligence, make ourselves 100% safe against terrorism is nuts. As case after case has shown, one malcontent getting a cousin or a brother or a friend, and getting some explosives and some weapons and going into a crowded place is going to kill a bunch of people and wound some more. And we can't do anything about that unless we want to turn the United States into a place that most of us don't want to live. So the honest thing to say to the American people is get over it. That this is the way life is, and that actually the risk of being killed by a terrorist compared to being killed in an automobile accident, being murdered or raped, or any other sorts of bad things happening to you are minuscule. And let's, as a country, not think that one terrorist attack is going to push the United States off of its stride. I like the Boston approach. You know, that after those embassy massacres, that basically the people of Boston said, "That's the best you can do? Come on, you know, is Boston tough?" I think we ought to be America tough. We have made it extremely difficult for people from places like Pakistan, Afghanistan, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, where most of the Islamic terrorists come from, to get into this country. It's hard as it can be. What you find in what's happened since then is that it's mostly individuals who pull a couple of friends or relatives into trying to do it. With that kind of a protective system, which we developed at great cost and great expense, with the activity of the FBI, which, by the way, has broken up more terrorist plots since 9/11 than anybody else, and they've primarily done it by posing as people who want to help terrorists and then capturing these people. Then I don't think it has to be the overwhelming focus of our overseas policy or intelligence the way it has been. We've got big fish to fry: China, Russia, the Ukraine, North Korea, Iran. These are the things that are going to determine the future of the United States in the world, not a couple of terrorists who come in and maybe hurt a few more people. So I think we have been over concerned with that once we got a grip after several years on what the real nature of the terrorist threat to the United States was. However, having said all that, I believe that that's not been the intelligence community that caused that to happen. I think that's been the overall direction of national security policy, and the intelligence community has just gone along serving the customer as it always does. And I think it's time for that focus to be broadened back to a lot of other concerns. Keep countering terrorism as an important but not dominant part of both our policy, and intelligence supports it, and we'll be in a lot better shape to deal with the world as it's coming at us in the future than we are right now.
Admiral, that's what I was going to ask you. Isn't it the job, I think I'm hearing you say that it's really policy's job to direct VIC, but shouldn't the DNI have some role in the allocation of those resources and the allocation of our collection posture across the globe, or does he or she just not have the bureaucratic stroke to get it done.
Right. Well, we invented this thing called the National Intelligence Priorities Framework, the NIPF, under this administration. And if you look at the NIPF, those problems are all about 1/4 of an inch from your nose. I think that's because it's been a secular trend, but this administration is worse than most of dealing with the crisis of the moment rather than thinking long term. And actually, I found as a DNI Director of National Intelligence that I had to make a conscious effort to pull resources out of the close fight and try to spend it on thinking more widely, thinking more deeply, laying in the structure that you have to do to deal with the threats that you know are coming. So I think if we just follow this National Intelligence Priority Framework, we're going to be running from fire to fire. You need a DNI to try to broaden that intelligence function so that you're worrying about the full range of things that could hurt the country.
Ambassador.
Okay, just on this specific point of allocation of resources and basically collection versus analysis. It seems to me that the typical American mindset about intelligence usually is about collection. It starts with James Bond. It starts with being a spy, James Bond, and then it moves on to the different collection methodologies, because actually we went and created different agencies for different collection methods. When in fact, I think you need a balance. You could almost make the case you need an analytically driven approach to intelligence. Because after all, what is it that you want? You want the end product. You want to be able to discern what the threats are from either the state actors or the non-state. You want leadership analyses. And actually, in fairness to President Bush, at least, who was the person I had the experience with, he was very interested in that kind of material. And we had something just about every day on what's going on in some of the different hotspots in the world in terms of analysis, whether it was the leadership in Iran or what's happening in North Korea and so on and so forth. But just that little simple distinction between analysis and collection, it seems to me, is a useful thing to focus on.
Admiral McConnell, well, let's see, we've got about 10 minutes to go, certainly less than 15. I wanted to get to cyber with you. Senator Collins said over and over that this is the great unfinished national security, at least legislative priority that we have. But so much of the legislative debate, having spent some time up there in the last few years, is about, well, NSA has all of the capability, but really none of the authority, and DHS has so much statutory authority, but not enough of the capability to get the job done. And so you've seen camps break out up on the Hill about, well, we absolutely, especially post-Snowden, have to go through the Department of Homeland Security to interface with the private sector, and others saying, well, we need the NSA to play a greater role. What's your view on this divide as an intel professional and a cyber expert?
I'd love to get into that, and will in just a second. I want to respond to something that Ambassador Negroponte said. Intelligence is a support function. I agree with that wholeheartedly. That's the whole framework of how I performed in my professional life, supporting something, operations or policy decisions, whatever it was. So it is a support function. However, I'd point out that the nation was committed to bringing Osama bin Laden to justice. And in that context, intelligence was the operation. If remember, Osama bin Laden was killed by SEALs under the direction, control, authority of the director of CIA as the operational commander. So it's not as clear cut all the time for me. The National Security Act 1947, as amended, includes covert action. So there's been a very strong operational role, which is a little different for the intel community normally. But in this circumstance, it was pulled out. Let me talk to cybersecurity. You heard Senator Collins say that systems today that would intercept malware and keep it out of our critical infrastructures or our businesses or whatever is you can't stop what you can't recognize. So virus protection would be built on the basis of being able to see it coming, recognize it, because you recognize it, you shut it down. I think this community should be tasked to collect all that malware before it's ever been used. And in fact, has been capable of doing some of that. Now, you ask about the authorities issue. If NSA collects it and they have the information, even if they see a cyber attack from a nation state being planned and starting to be executed, their authority is to write a report. I think that's fundamentally unsatisfactory. Now, on my watch, what I strongly recommended to the Secretary of Defense, we create Cyber Command and make that one person's commander of Cyber Command the same person as the director of NSA, because the capabilities resident in NSA are the tools by which you would do not only exploitation, signals intelligence, that's what we all grew up with, that's passively reading the other guy's mail. But those same tools give you the ability to defend and to attack. And so we tried to put that together. Now, here's where it falls down. All the authority rests in the Department of Homeland Security. And the Department of Homeland Security has chosen, more often than not, to see NSA as the enemy, not as a partner. And it becomes the bureaucratic issue of who gets credit, who's in charge, who's in control. So the arguments I've made for legislation is I believe that the intelligence community should be directed by an act of Congress signed by the President, that they are directed to collect this information and share it with corporate America, at a minimum, the critical infrastructures.
Share it
Banking.
directly, not through the Department of Homeland Security.
Share it effectively. Now, you can debate what does effective mean. I would argue it has to be at network speed, because if you're going to move with alacrity, the network speed from Tokyo to New York is 30 milliseconds, so this has got to run quickly. So I think we need to solve the turf wars between who's in charge and who gets credit and who's authority and so on, and define a system that lets us redefine the legislative landscape to bring all the tools of the nation's capability from the federal government to bear. In addition to, there's tremendous capability in the private sector, but they are prohibited from sharing on the basis of antitrust, competitive advantage, liability. If there's a breach, they don't want to tell anybody because they'll be sued by their stockholders or their members of the business. So we need to change that legislative landscape to be able to deal with this. A couple of quick notes just to put it in perspective. The internet today is a golf ball. In a few years, when we go to IPv6, it'll be the size of the sun. Let me say that differently. You can put up several billion connections to the internet today. We're going to a billion. I think that's a quadrillion. I don't whatever it is. Let me put that in perspective. That's the ability to connect every grain of sand on the earth to the internet.
Yes, sir.
So where we are on this issue is it's captured our attention as a problem, as a golf ball. It's going to be as big as the sun. So we've got to deal with this in a very different way.
It's time to take some audience questions. We've got one in writing, but if others have any, raise your hand, and we have folks with microphones that can come around. But here's the first one from the audience. Everyone's agreed intelligence is a support function. What grade would you give the IC in supporting national and tactical decision makers over the past 10 years? Admiral Blair, why don't we'll do a lightning round and then start with you and come this way.
Well, I think one of the great advances in intelligence was the support to operations in the field through Iraq and Afghanistan, and I think the ability to bring what was formerly highly classified intelligence down to the secret level, to integrate it with systems like the regional gateway, which brought signals intelligence and imagery intelligence together on the same screen down at the brigade level, the work with both within agencies of the United States and with allied intelligence agencies was one of the great successes of military intelligence support. So I think that has made tremendous gains, partly with the IRTPA legislation, but mostly the exigencies of in combat, and a lot of good heads of agencies sent their people forward, and there's there's nothing like causing cooperation among warring intelligence agencies in the sound of mortar fire, which is landing nearby, and that was done wonderfully. On support to policymaking intelligence, I think that has improved some since 2001, but not quite as dramatically as the other, and that's the area where I think that a DNI, by forming integrated teams dedicated to the hard problems that we face for policymakers in Iran, Korea, China, and Russia, could make the most difference.
Ambassador Negroponte.
Yeah, before the Admiral started speaking, the first thing that came to mind was Zarqawi and bin Laden, which really symbolized the integration of our intelligence at the pointed end of the spear. So I think you have to give out an A there. There's no question about it. I think maybe where we have some more challenges, and we were talking about it earlier, is in the area of cyber, and then domestic. We still haven't really figured out the whole state, local, tribal. I mean, there's been good work done on it, but it just needs more work and time. But I think overall, the performance has been excellent.
Admiral McConnell, do you have a quick answer? I haven't seen any hands go up, so go ahead.
The scale of 1 to 10, national, I'd say 7, with the exception of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. I think that was politicized. My view is we wanted to believe it, and we allowed ourselves to believe it. That's a huge failing of the community that we should work hard to prevent. Example, we did the National Intelligence Estimate on the Iranian nuclear weapons program. We found evidence that they stopped it. As a policy matter, they stopped it in 2003 after we invaded Iraq. We rolled that out, and I can't tell you the love letters I received from the U.S. Congress, to the point that I was a communist and I had done a great disservice to my country, and I had let my president down because I told the truth as we understood it. So on a 1 to 10, I give us a 7. On a tactical level, I go to 8. I'm a pretty hard grader.
You are.
But I would go to 8.
Okay, great. I see a question back there.
Hi. Bill Nolte from the University of Maryland. Admiral McConnell has mentioned an information environment that makes Moore's Law look glacial in terms of speed. And yet some of the other comments from the panel talk about an intelligence community that in its structure and its processes dates to some degree from the post-9/11 era or even the Cold War. And I'm just curious as to whether you think it's time for us to take a serious look at structure and processes of what an environment for intelligence might be in 2025 or 2030. This is something the services, I think, have done better historically than the intelligence community. But depending on what that environment is, what has to happen or what might have to happen to the intelligence community, and including maybe an agency or two goes away or is dramatically transformed?
I would start by creating a Department of Cyber. I think it's going to be that significant. And then I would task the intelligence community to support that, just like they support military operations or State Department or whatever. I don't disagree with Admiral Blair's comments about rethinking the community to get those who are expert in a discipline, do that discipline, be the professionals, and do it well. But where do you do the integration of at the national estimates level? And we could probably rethink that and improve it. But significantly up our skills in cyber as to what it's going to mean to businesses in the country as we go forward, and internationally.
All right, we're running out of time, but let's do Charlie Allen and then the gentleman in the corner, and then we'll wind up.
Yes, any of the former DNIs. The DNI Blair made the DCIA the executive agent for open source in 2010. I want your views on how you see open source in the future in this sort of tactical environment we find ourselves, where much of the information is out there, it's on the net. How can we make it more central to our operations? Because we're moving at wire speed, I think, as Bill Nolte said, and we've got to operate and be nimble and agile. And I don't think open source, frankly, is in the center of gravity as it should be today.
Yeah, I'll take a first whack at that. I think it speaks to the difference between expertise and analytical skills. And what I think is true I think the intelligence community has many experts, but by and large it has analysts. We don't have people sitting there 30 years on worrying about the same little piece of a country or so. There are people in the outside world, whether they be academic or reporters or something, who have that kind of expertise, which gives you the gut feel, the finger feel of what's going on in that country to set the framework. I think we should be able to tap them more regularly. We bring them in for NIEs and things like that, but I think it could be much more regular. And then in the area of more tactical, what's happening tomorrow, I think although we're doing a lot in the intelligence community, the analysts that are supporting the financial community, trying to figure out where commodity markets are going tomorrow so they can make a hundredth of a point on some commodity transaction, or doing some incredibly imaginative big data analytics on all the data that's now becoming available that I think we can take much better advantage of. And the things that get in the way of that are mechanical things like clearances and integrating classified and unclassified information. I think those are solvable, but I don't think we put our shoulders to the wheel as we should to be able to do that, Charlie.
Okay, last question over.
Joe Mazafro, the question I have is whether it's mythology or history. We're told that the ODNI was originally envisioned as a management oversight coordination organization staff. It seems over time now, the 10 years, to have morphed into a large quasi-execution staff with numerous functions. So my question really is the size of the ODNI too big, too small, just right?
It's what was given to us by Congress. I used to run into this reaction in Congress that we built the big, huge bureaucracy and so forth. And we took the community management staff and then we added onto it the centers that were created. And the only thing that grew substantially during the time I was there was the National Counterterrorism Center, and that grew by a factor of hundreds, not thousands or anything like that. So, I mean, I think it's been kept in good proportion. And as to your comment about moving from management or coordination to execution, I think you've heard some ideas about execution, but I think the ODNI is still not an operational entity by any means. I personally didn't advocate it, but I think you've heard all sorts of different points of view up here as to how to move forward.
Does anyone else want to add?
I would agree with that.
Okay. Thank you so much to INSA and to our panelists. I think this is the first time we've had the three of you together in a public forum to address your tenures, so I think this was a contribution to history. And thank you all for your service to your country and your wisdom today, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael.